What if we all just disappeared? That's 8,102,260,466 people wiped off the face of the planet overnight. No nuclear missiles, no wars that were fought to result in this. We just went extinct all of a sudden. All of us vanished into thin air, leaving our homes and the lives that we had behind. What would the vast changes as a result of our departure look like? When humans can't conquer the planet anymore, who takes over? This is What If We Disappeared? This is the population clock for the world. As of the time of this recording, the world population is sitting at 8 billion. Most of this population belongs to a few select countries. In both China and India alone, there are almost 3 billion people within their borders. So what if we did vanish? Billions of lives across the world, gone. Planes flying overhead would suddenly crash. Cars ramming into one another with no one on the brakes. That woman at the grocery store, gone. The man walking down the street, gone. Empty courtrooms, empty streets, empty everything. In such a nightmare scenario, we need to look at 3 categories to organize the effects of the fallout. The immediate effects, then long-term, and finally, the unlikely but possible results of our disappearances. From human projects such as power grid failures to animal life like forgotten pets, to this. What would happen to the world that we left behind? And could traces of our existence eventually cease to exist? Before I dive into the immediate effects, I kindly ask you to subscribe if you're interested in this kind of content. It supports the work that I'm doing, and studies show that the more you learn, the smarter you become, and it all starts with a habit, and that is a subscription. Thinkus is pushing 10 subscribers soon, so let's get to that goal. Thank you. The day that humans vanish, disastrous effects will immediately be seen across the world. For starters, the lights would go out sooner than later. Without constant maintenance, the main power grids would completely shut down. Manpower is needed to provide fuel for most energy production methods to keep up with the demanding efforts of what once took up the Earth. Although there will be other sources of power that will exist for a time, those being powered by solar panels generally don't make up a large portion of our global energy production. Without humans, blackouts will continue to occur with no one left to fix them. Rust will form, gears would fail, and most automatic systems would be out within a year. But surprisingly, AC, refrigerators, and lava lamps would continue running for days on end. There are humans constantly driving on long highways and city streets, and upon our disappearance, those cars would continue driving in a constant direction until they either decelerate or crash into something. With no one left to take care of their property, any remaining vehicles will be left to rust. Whatever billions of humans were holding at the time will also drop on floors across the world. Without human maintenance, servers hosting sites such as YouTube and this video that you're watching will eventually shut down. There will still, however, be power generated that can continue for months without human maintenance, specifically hydroelectric dams. Although power continues for a few months, more immediately, the stock market drops to zero, and nothing more abstract than gross domestic product, or GDP, becomes useless instantly. As with many of our innovations, satellites would continue operating until they run out of power. Without humans to control or repair them, they would eventually fall out of orbit, re-entering the Earth's atmosphere and burning up. While the short-term impacts are foreseeable to an extent, the long-term ramifications remain contingent on a myriad of variables that we need to consider. Now let's talk long-term. For the first 100 years, corrosion in nuclear, chemical, and power plants, as well as limited dry cleaners, will set off ticking time bombs across the world that periodically go off. Many of which, without human supervision, will gradually poison the Earth's atmosphere over time and cause destruction as well as pollution. With our disappearance, the fields we have sown and planted would be left out of our supervision. Without humans to tend to them, agricultural fields would undergo drastic changes. Crops that rely on human intervention for planting, watering, and harvesting would wither and die. Over time, fields would revert to their natural states, with wild plants and weeds taking over. Although the lands that grew our food are accounted for, what about our pets, our livestock, our domesticated animals? Well, natural selection would occur. As Charles Darwin emphasized in his theory of evolution, survival of the fittest. In general, it comes down to the harsh truth. Without a caretaker, your puppies and kittens will be left to fend for their lives. Animals at the zoo will have no choice but to attempt escape, in which most will die. The cages they are in are meant for them specifically after all. And even if they do successfully attempt to escape, the outside world is completely foreign to them, having spent their entire lives in captivity, so they will most likely perish anyways. The overall idea of domestication will slowly turn to dust as house cats turn feral and dogs feed on prey out in the wild. Overall, there would be billions of animal deaths, including livestock. Something that can't be glossed over is the shift in ecosystems around the world. In those environments, invasive species brought over by humans will continue to thrive, especially without the usual human specialists to combat them. When species are brought from one environment to another, they can ruin the ecosystem. While they thrive, they also risk the deaths or even extinction of other species in the area. For instance, algae are some of the most notable species of invasives. Although algae themselves are a good food source for a lot of aquatic and land animals alike, they do provide one inevitable thing from their mere existence: shade. Now, shade in of itself isn't damaging, but when you have ponds or lakes that ecosystems rely on and algae populate it, their shade can shut out sunlight from the marine animals that do depend on them. Without sunlight, fish would eventually start dying in mass, with mass death causing pollution on the waters. Corpses of animals would float in the ponds and lakes. Most animals won't be able to get to their main food source, unable to eat the rotten fish, and they too will perish. In this vicious cycle, there will be species that eventually disappear, just like us. On day one of our disappearance, the innovations of mankind, of course, would be left behind. Nature would mount its fight to take back the land that used to be theirs. Because no architect or engineer accounted for us disappearing overnight all of a sudden, the infrastructure in place would make it easy for nature to take the reins of mankind's projects. Forests and greenery will soon take over, and many ruined buildings will have overgrown plants, trees, and animals alike inhabiting them. With no one to manage their cleanliness, roads will soon become cracked as vines and moss grow over them. More ironically, secure facilities such as bank vaults, designed for stability and safety in mind, will still have their money intact, although granted useless within the centuries following our disappearance. And such an experiment of restricting once active human activities has been seen in areas before, most notably in the Chernobyl accident in 1986. Where a nuclear power plant exploded and radiated the atmosphere, and people ceased to live there. Decades later, pictures of a Chernobyl shrouded in greenery started emerging in media. But being overtaken by vegetation might not be the worst fate for our legacy. Without regular maintenance, large structures like dams, bridges, and skyscrapers would eventually collapse. Dams breaking would lead to massive floods, altering landscapes and ecosystems. Within days of our disappearance, hundreds of nuclear plants across the world will continue running on autopilot until eventually, without human supervision, each one will start overheating and or shut down due to the safeguards in place. And despite the safeguards of some nuclear plants, others will melt or burn with radiation released into the environment or leaked into the waters, making the area uninhabitable for living non-humans. In the long term, without firemen, lightning will strike places that will ignite fires that spread from place to place. These wildfires, without anyone to fight against them, will continue to ravage the planet. Within the next few years of our disappearance, bursting pipes, sprung leaks, and other calamities in households will occur, making homes even more vulnerable to external factors such as blowing winds or even hurricanes and tornadoes. Homeowners know for themselves how costly it is to maintain their homes on a year-by-year basis, but if they're gone, who's to stop termites from taking over or water from leaking continuously in a house? In the grand scheme of things, nature will take back its properties from humans. An architect named Chris Riddle once said, "If you want to destroy a barn, cut an 18-inch square hole in the roof, then stand back." Nature's waged war against the creations of mankind would start in the form of water. The liquid from rain and snow would start bleeding into the wood frame constructed houses, the most commonly used technique to build residential homes around the world. Over the next 50 to 100 years, coupled with animals such as woodpeckers feeding off the buildings, the wood still rotting eventually caves, and houses upon houses collapse like a house of cards. Forests will stand in places where suburbs once existed, helped by nature's weaponized use of water. For cities, surprisingly, it's easier for water to exist. There are buildings that block sunlight from evaporating water, as well as a lack of soil present, instead substituted by concrete sidewalks that make it impossible to absorb any liquids. So upon our disappearance in more urban areas, water starts its attack by flooding the underbellies of these cities, the sewage systems. Already, there are hydraulic supervisors in New York City that manage the millions of gallons of water that could flood subway tunnels. And in 2024, even with human intervention, there was still substantial flooding in New York City, one of the biggest cities on Earth. Now imagine how easier it would be for water to take over big cities without humans even present to stop or prevent it. Eventually, the water in big cities would rise, and avenues and streets become rivers. Within the next few decades, the water would corrode these buildings, full of green, until nothing is left of it. Any other trace of our existence, such as the fruits we ate, like broccoli, cabbages, and Brussels sprouts, will revert back to the ancestors that we selectively bred and mutated. In tens of thousands of years, if our modern activities of contributing carbon dioxide aren't too far gone, the ice will return. Glaciers would flatten any remaining remnants of civilization. And in more than 100,000 years, the geologic cycle would take the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere back to pre-human levels, with our emissions in the atmosphere having been our longest-standing project. If you're not from Eastern Europe, you're most likely unfamiliar with a place out there called the Białowieża Forest. It's a forest that has existed for centuries with little human intervention. Threading near the border between Poland and Belarus, Białowieża is one of the last remaining remnants of a Europe that once looked completely embedded in nature. With the rich air provided by the lichens, it's what you don't hear a lot of. Just stillness with nature's sounds. In light of all of this news, there would be surprisingly positive effects of our disappearance. Vegetation and wildlife would thrive, and more places would look like the Białowieża. Biodiversity around the world will increase as human activity, driving many species to extinction, ceases. For instance, mosquitoes will surprisingly increase in population by the billions, as many that would have died otherwise will now thrive with nectar substituted for blood. Perhaps it was a human-specific virus that made us all disappear. Speaking of, COVID-19 provided a picture of what such a scenario would look like for the environment if we disappeared, at least in the short term. In 2020, with the absence of human activity, especially in highly populated areas, the environment already started to take back its properties. The biodiversity in places such as Italy thrived, with dolphins returning to the water canals, and under lockdowns, the ozone layer started healing. Now, looking at the final category of unlikely but possible, there are so many theories on where the world could go after humanity perishes. Amidst these uncertainties, one interesting theory is evolution by another species. Evolution is very mechanical and straightforward. Those that are fit survive. Circling back to the Darwin theory I mentioned earlier, if survival is determined by who has the sharpest teeth, then certain animals in that species will eventually evolve to have very sharp teeth. If survival in another species is determined by who runs the fastest, then survival will be determined by who runs the fastest. Existing species will evolve to adapt to the world without us. But would another dominant species evolve from one of those leftover species on Earth, possibly containing a similar level of intelligence and separation from other animals as humanity once had? Would they be able to essentially start humanity 2.0? Keeping this in mind, humans are smart, but smart specifically in our advancement of technology to aid our conquest of Earth. If the environment of certain species does not demand the evolution of smarts, then there will be no species with similar smarts as us. Another theory to think about is artificial intelligence, or AI. What if the species that comes after us isn't biological, but machine? Before we left the planet, did one of us program in secret, out of the public eye, a sentient and self-sufficient AI? Would it be able to break loose, understand the world without human input? If the stars aligned, any of these theories could point to intelligent life comparable to humans after us. With the end of humanity, how long would it take for another similarly intelligent species to be prominent on Earth, with the intellect to build what we have built and communicate what we have communicated to our kind? In general, this is just luck of the draw. Will there be a species as smart as us? Probably, but it could be millions or billions of years after our disappearance. But these scenarios only open more doors. On that note of humanity 2.0, let's think about us. The human legacy extends far among the planet. Cities, monuments, art, and technology are all part of our legacy. Without humans to maintain and care for them, these elements would begin to decay. Buildings and infrastructure would start to crumble. Vegetation would drown out once prominent places of existence for humanity. Iconic landmarks like the Eiffel Tower would stand as silent sentinels for a while, but in thousands of years would eventually succumb to the forces of nature, with no one to bear witness. In retrospect, perhaps even if we accounted for this extreme scenario of a world without us, still we would only delay the inevitable. The Statue of Liberty would be gone, so would the Great Wall of China eventually as well. The human legacy will see itself out the door. Books, artworks, and digital data would degrade and become lost media. Libraries would become homes for animals and insects. Digital archives, dependent on electricity and maintenance, would be lost as servers fail and storage devices deteriorate, and the memory of us fades away. Because forever is forever, everything we have would be gone soon enough. Despite the horrendous look of civilization in the short run after our disappearance, nature would heal itself in the long run. And you know what? Life goes on. Such a scenario of us going out like this opens up many philosophical questions, such as what really matters in life in the grand scheme of things. What are your thoughts if we disappeared? Let me know in the comments below. I'm curious. Thanks for watching.